Perfect. Hey, thank you all so much. And thanks for the introduction, Fawn. So I'm here to talk about some of the work that our lab does, really on using seabirds to help study Oregon's coastal ecosystems. And I apologize for you not in Oregon. This will be a very Oregon-centric talk, um, but a lot of the same species and ecological processes are happening in Washington, BC, and Southeast Alaska as well. So hopefully some of these points will be relevant no matter where in the Northwest you all find yourselves. And I'm just one small part of the Seabird Oceanography Lab. There's really a core group of five of us, led by Dr. Rachel Orban. We have a couple graduate students, other faculty research assistants. And while I do a lot of the work in Oregon, um, I'm just one member of the team. So even though I'm the one presenting, I just want to acknowledge that, none of this work would be possible without the contributions of these people, as well as a number of undergraduate interns and summer workers. So deeply appreciate all of the work that they've done. And it's really fun to work in our lab. We have a number of projects on seabirds going on throughout the world. We have a PhD student working with penguins in the Antarctic. We do a lot of work with albatross throughout the Pacific. Part of our group tags cormorants to understand their behavior and how we can use cormorants as oceanographers throughout the world. But what I'm really here to talk about, and really the core of my work, is right here at home in the Northwest. And since moving here 6 or 7 years ago, this was really fallen in love with the birds on this side of the continent. Um, and I'm really passionate and excited to share with you all about these species. So Oregon has nearly 2,000 offshore rocks, reefs, and islands that are part of the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. Pretty much all up and down the coast, with just a little gap in the middle of the state where the Oregon dunes are. Um, and on all of these islands, we have breeding a breeding population of about 2 million seabirds of 14 species. So it's an incredible place to study seabirds. We have a number of breeding species such as Caspian terns, Brandt's cormorants, as well as a few others, western gulls, pigeon guillemots, tufted puffins, and common murres. Um, these three down on the bottom are all in the alcid family, so you can think of it as the puffin family. And oftentimes they are some of the most visible in terms of guillemots and murres, and certainly most charismatic and popular among the general public, especially for puffins. In addition, we have probably a similar number in diversity of visitors. So these are birds that breed elsewhere, but come spend part of the year in Oregon and the Northwest. So we have black-footed albatross that breed in the Hawaiian Islands, brown pelicans that breed in the Channel Islands and Baja California, surf scoters that breed on the Canadian Shield, black-legged kittiwakes from, generally up in Alaska, BC, as well as sooty shearwaters that here probably breed mostly down in New Zealand. So, and they come all the way up to take advantage of some of these marine resources, these huge pulses associated with upwelling that we have during our summers. So between these millions and millions of birds and a huge number of species, Oregon is just an incredible place to be a seabirder, and the same is definitely true throughout the Northwest. Um, Unfortunately, seabirds are one of the most threatened groups of birds globally. So nearly half of all the species were found to be declining in a recent meta-analysis. Um, and a follow-up study essentially found that there were three main threats globally that were driving some of these declines. So that's things like invasive species at breeding sites. So cats, rats, mice. Those are probably the worst offenders. Um, there have been a lot of negative interactions with commercial fisheries. So here is an example of bycatch of an albatross in a long line, pelagic long line. Essentially, the albatross will try to take the bait off of the long line as it's being set, and sometimes they can, sneak the squid off and get a free meal out of it. Other times they find themselves getting hooked and drowned in a pretty terrible death. And for species with low reproductive rates and long lifespans, like seabirds, especially albatross, this is hugely destructive, especially when there are thousands and thousands of birds being killed every year, especially in the South and Central Pacific, like the New Zealand pelagic longline fleets. So this is another really dramatic threat to seabirds globally. Thankfully, not as much of an issue in the Northwest, but we still certainly have have a lot of projects in our lab working on trying to minimize these interactions. And there's also, of course, marine pollution. Probably the most popular or most well-known, I should say, one is oil spills, which have happened here in the Northwest, everything from the Exxon Valdez to the New Carissa. Um, so these are all threats that are having a huge impact on seabirds globally and have made this a really threatened group of birds. The good news, though, is to bring us back up from that low point, is that seabirds in Oregon and the Northwest are generally doing fairly well. If I had to make a big blanket statement, I don't want to minimize these threats, but I do want to acknowledge the great work that people have done in recent decades um, in protecting our seabird populations, especially, say, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in protecting those 2,000 islands, most of which are quite small, but still support huge numbers of breeding seabirds. So that's been incredible at keeping our populations of seabirds relatively healthy. But there are always new threats emerging all the time. Um, Potentially offshore wind, which if it's not sited correctly, could be problematic. There's always, ongoing climate change. We have more frequent and intense El Niños potentially associated with climate change. Um, and there's always the threat of developing new fisheries for species that seabirds depend on. So there's unfortunately always going to be work to be done in trying to make sure that our populations can stay relatively healthy. And you can tell just uh, really the impact and relevance of seabirds by how often a seabird story appears in the newspaper around here. Whether it's seabirds predating on salmon stocks, especially some of the really endangered salmon stocks, which, spoiler alert, they're not endangered because of the birds. They might be inhibiting the recovery, but just a tiny bit of the problem there. Um, it's always a concern when we see large numbers of seabirds washing up dead on beaches, even though a certain amount of that is very normal and it's not something to worry about. But there are certain huge wrecks when we have large numbers of birds coming ashore, and that can be really indicative of big problems farther out at sea. And then there's also problems with the Endangered Species Act, whether it's tufted puffins in the lower 48 recently being denied listing, or marbled murrelets stopping timber sales. So seabirds aren't just interesting to study in their own right, which I would absolutely say they deserve to be studied no matter what. Um, there's also a huge relevance for human society. So that our objectives in the Seabird Oceanography Lab is we really try to perform research with some real world applications. So things that we can understand about seabird biology that can also be used and applied for seabird conservation and natural resource management. We want to understand what factors are actually influencing these seabird populations. It's really important to know, you know, what kind of conditions species does well in if we're trying to conserve and increase populations of that or related species. And even for some species, it's just a basic biology that we still don't really even understand. And if we don't have those basics known, there's absolutely no way that we can fully protect their life cycle and understand what they need to survive. And one of the places we do a lot of our work is Yaquina Head Outstanding Natural Area. So this is a really beautiful headland with a historic 93-foot lighthouse up on the tip that's located just a couple miles from where I live in Newport. Um, it attracts huge numbers of tourists every year. It's stunningly beautiful, and it's also an incredible natural laboratory with huge numbers of breeding seabirds breeding on the offshore rocks. I mean, visible very easily from a handicapped, accessible, paved walkway. There's not many places in the world you can see bird concentrations like that with this kind of accessibility. And being so close to town, it's a great place to study all of these natural processes and basic biology of a lot of species. Um, so the first seabird research project, um, at least in our continuous, uh, on this project was started in the late 90s by Dr. Julia Parrish, who's at the University of Washington. That project lasted a few years and then lapsed. Everyone got busy, moved on to other projects, funding scarcities, but recognizing how important this site was, Dr. Rob Suryan, who was formerly a professor at Oregon State, restarted work in 2007, and work since then has continued continuously. Every single summer, we're out there doing our work, even as the lab is now passed on to Dr. Rachel Orban, who currently is the head of the lab. And at Yaquina Head, it's a great place to start to examine a couple big questions in ecology, such as what regulates animal populations. Really, we talk about things that are top down, like predation, operating from the top of the trophic chain, the food chain, um, or bottom up, so things like food availability. And typically, we think that top down factors, such as predation, are most important in terrestrial systems. So it's really the impact of lions that impact how many impala there are here. While the availability of food is certainly important sometimes, but is of lesser import in driving the population of the impala in this system. But in marine systems, we think that it's generally bottom-up factors that play a bigger role. And that's sort of been the assumption for many, many years now. And for those of you who do work in tide pools or benthic intertidal systems, to have a disclaimer, um, this is especially true for pelagic, so open water, mid-water column species and ecosystems. Predation certainly might play a bigger impact in intertidal systems, such as work on controlling invertebrate populations with, you know, sea stars being a top predator. So just keep that in mind. But in open water, open ocean systems, it's generally thought that the availability of food, say these timing and strength of these phytoplankton blooms, that's what really drives the productivity and success of these ecosystems. So this is kind of what a lot of our work at Yaquina Head looks like. It's generally pretty simple in methods and requires an awful lot of patience. We will go out early in the morning in all kinds of weather and use our spotting scopes to monitor a set number of plots of breeding seabirds, and number of nests. So using these scopes, we can look in at a couple of areas of the rock with some distinct features. We're not able to access these rocks because they're terribly steep and crumbly and 150 feet tall. So we have to use rocks with these kind of distinct curves or corners and can identify breeding birds by their position here. So we take photos and just draw on them to identify individual species, individual birds. Um, and using that, we can follow these same plots and these same birds throughout the year, and we'll try to follow those same plots over many, many years. And so by here, looking at a group of common Murres that are breeding, we can see that there's one that has a little thing poking out from under it. And we can also use, say, the body position of these birds. So as they're sitting with the wing cocked out or their belly not quite on the ground, that's really good indication that there's an egg or a chick under there. And if you go back here, you can just here in the bottom left see a bit of the egg poking out. But with a lot of predators around, say gulls trying to snatch eggs if adults aren't ready, um, they don't make it easy to see. So this certainly is where a lot of the patience is required. Um, and we try to ask a couple of really basic questions in doing this work. So how many adults are in this monitoring plot? How many of them end up laying eggs? How many of the eggs survive to hatch? And then how many of these chicks survive to fledge? And if you know anything about common Murres, they have a pretty interesting life history where chicks are only at the colony for 2 or 3 weeks after hatching, which is not enough time to grow up all the way. They can't fly when they leave the colony, and so they jump off the cliffs. They can't fly. They hopefully make it down to the water, but many of them hit a rock or two on the way down. Thankfully, they're pretty tough and they're able to jump off the cliffs and end up in this water and go to sea with their dads for several weeks. It's always the male parent that takes them out and will feed them off at sea. So it's really cool to see. For us, it's about August when the chicks jump off the cliffs, especially in the evening. If you have an opportunity to try to see that, I definitely recommend. And I'll talk a lot about common murres today. They're the most abundant and probably the most visible species at Yaquina Head, but we also are monitoring pelagic cormorants, Brandt's cormorants, as well as western gulls. Our time series and data just don't extend it quite as far back for these species, but we're really interested in their biology and breeding success as well. And when this project was started, and especially when it was restarted in about 2007, this is generally what the view from the Yaquina Head overlook looked like to Colony Rock. There were just absolutely enormous numbers of murres breeding there, nesting in these really, really dense aggregations. There can be somewhere between 30 and 50 murres nesting per square meter on some of these big flat open sites. And they produced lots of chicks pretty much every year. So it was a really big and productive colony. And if you look here at counts produced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service during some of their more or less annual aerial surveys, you see that the population has really just exploded since the 1970s at Yaquina Head, especially when this project was first starting in the 90s and then mid 2000s. This is a period of really, really rapid growth that peaked at almost 70,000 birds breeding at Yaquina Head. And to understand that, we have to think about what's also going on during the late 20th century. And that's a lot of pesticide use during the middle of the century. So DDT is probably the best known of them, certainly not the only one, but was used as um, on both people, a lot of, say, marshland habitats, as well as, of course, in agricultural settings to limit insect use, but had impacts far beyond that. And led to eggshell thinning and really declined reproduction of a number of large bird species, especially that are higher up in the trophic system. So things like peregrine falcons, osprey, brown pelicans, and bald eagles all had really rapid population declines during the middle of the 20th century. And the later part of that, into the early 2000s, really saw their populations of all four of these species decline, or excuse me, expand dramatically during that period. So that's important to keep in mind here. So yeah, when Silent Spring was published by Rachel Carson, really putting the DDT and pesticide issue into the public spotlight. There were only 417 bald eagle nests across the whole lower 48. Thankfully, because of legal protections and public outcry that came out of that book, DDT was banned in 1972 when bald eagles were added to the Endangered Species Act the following year. So those legal protections really helped bald eagles expand their populations really dramatically and recover from pesticide use. And this can be seen really dramatically within Oregon. We thankfully have some of those data because of really funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service that came out of the ESA listing. We know, for instance, that in 1978, there were only about 50 bald eagle nests in the whole state. But by 2007, there were 10 times as many. We had basically about 500 nests in 2007, which is when bald eagles were actually announced to be recovered and were removed from the Endangered Species Act, which does unfortunately mean that there's a little bit less monitoring of the species now, but is overall just one of the greatest conservation success stories in American history. But because of bald eagles, we've had this sort of unintended consequence where at these seabird colonies, we've started to see bald eagles more and more often. Um, they have a reputation of just eating, eating fish or stealing fish or eating carrion, but they are really active predators and they feed on water birds quite often, and are really drawn to the colonies of seabirds. Um, so periodically we get to see a bald eagle fly in, scare away the thousands of Murres that are breeding there. Um, Oftentimes they'll catch an adult that they can feed on or bring back to their chicks. And it's so super dramatic and stunning. And everybody just has to stop what they're doing and take a look at this. Um, but while this is, certainly dramatic and attention grabbing, probably the more destructive thing from the Murres perspective is going on right here. So as all the thousands and thousands of adult Murres are scared away by the eagle coming in, they leave their nests, their eggs, their chicks unattended, and all of these gulls, crows, ravens that are around the colony can follow the eagle in and in its wake eat up all the eggs and chicks. And to really provide an example of this, just in 1 year of our study in 2020, for instance, we directly observed bald eagles take 11 adults during our monitoring at Yaquina Head. And over the exact same time period, we saw 671 eggs get taken. Um, so orders of magnitude more eggs taken than adults. And this is a little bit contrary to what a lot of the foundational papers of seabird biology really say. So if you look at all of these great papers from the 60s, 70s, 80s, they talk about that really the number of birds is dependent on the amount of food rather than other factors. So it's the bottom up is more important than the top down regulation. And I suppose this isn't surprising considering during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, populations of top predators, especially things like peregrine falcons and bald eagles that are uh, major predators at seabird colonies around the world, um, they were at really a low point in their population that we've never seen before. So, of course, people got this conclusion studying predators, studying seabirds and their predators in a world where they didn't really have any. And that's changing. And to some extent, this is approaching probably what things were like hundreds of years ago, but we're not entirely certain of that either. In the present day, though, the increase in bald eagle disturbance, bald eagle presence at the colony has had some pretty dramatic effects. So, in our years of study, we've been able to find that in years with a higher bald eagle disturbance rate, here on the left on the x-axis, leads to lower Murre reproductive success. So, more eagles lead to fewer Murres successfully breeding, and this has led to fewer Murres at the colony in general. So, when this project started restarted in 2007, we were really at the high point of the Yaquina Head colony, generally 60 to 70,000 Murres attending each year. And we've seen a pretty steep drop off in the number of Murres at the colony in the decade or two since then. A decline essentially as steep as the increase that we saw a couple decades previous. And of course, anytime that we come across a decline of a species that's this dramatic, such a decline in reproductive success, it draws a lot of attention, and we have to assess if this is really a problem and if there are things that land managers and conservationists need to do. Do we need to take management action? And unfortunately, this alone is not a value judgment that um, science alone can't answer. This is something that we have to talk to stakeholders, assess different value judgments of people. What do we want from these protected lands? What kind of populations are we managing for? It's especially problematic because, of course, bald eagles are a native species and an extremely protected one, even though they're not on the Endangered Species Act anymore. They're, of course, protected as one of our national symbols. Um, and so that has to be weighed in pretty heavily. This isn't a cat or a rat that's causing these population impacts. And they certainly preyed on Murres hundreds of years ago for time immemorial. Um, we unfortunately don't have a great, at least Western science understanding of how this might have played out years and years ago, but we do know that there were larger salmon runs in previous years, as well as probably more whales washing up. Larger whale populations just mean more dead whales on the beach. And bald eagles were certainly taking advantage of all those other food sources and not just seabirds. Um, so while their population might be recovering to what it used to be, they certainly have fewer food options at the same time. But thankfully, I'm happy to announce that the Murres aren't completely helpless. They're adapting to this new normal, living in a predator-full world. So, for instance, whereas we saw in the later 20th century, it seemed to be this huge movement of Murres from small surrounding colonies into a few really big mega colonies. We seem to see the opposite happening now. We started monitoring a new seabird colony in Depot Bay at Pirate Cove in 2022, which we know from a couple of band resighting records that some of the Murres from Yaquina Head actually flew to another site and started a new sort of sub-colony, a splinter group, to spread their numbers out. So we're seeing a greater number of small colonies as a method of basically counteracting the increased eagle pressure. We're seeing a shift in nesting sites too. So instead of them all nesting on the top of Colony Rock, where there was a lot of great open space, we're seeing more and more Murres, especially the ones that end up breeding successfully, are now nesting in sort of the narrower cracks and crevices on the sides of these rocks where the rock walls provide a lot more protection from aerial predators. And we've also seen a really, really fascinating phenological shift. So that's a shift in the timing of Murre reproduction. So here on the x-axis, we have year increasing from left to right. And on the y-axis, we have the day of the year. So 180 being right around the halfway point of the year in late June. And as you go up, that's increasingly later in the year. So we see that as time has gone on, we've seen that Murres are now breeding. So this is median hatch date later and later in the year, to the point that in 2007, we were seeing that generally Murres would be hatching in, say, mid to late June. At this point, it's happening at least a month later, uh, well into July. In 2023, especially, you can see that one red dot that's much higher than everything else. That was me monitoring the Murre colony into early September, which is just unheard of. And we have strong reason to believe that the eagles are a big part of this shift in the timing of breeding. Um, but for a while, this story has played out in sort of a predictable pattern. Our data were aligning well, and that increasing eagle presence is really impacting reproduction. So for instance, here in red, we see the disturbance rate. So how often per hour are we seeing eagles come in and disturb the colony? And in blue here, we're seeing the number of eggs per hour that are taken by the eagles and the secondary predators. So the gulls, the crows, and the ravens. And you can see that they line up quite well up till about 2014, 2015. And then all of a sudden, these lines just go completely apart, often in very opposite directions and very, very far apart. And that was quite perplexing. We're not 100% sure of the precise mechanism behind that. But for those of you who are from this region, you might know about something big that happened in 2014, 2015, something very, very big. And that was sort of the blob marine heat wave. Um, blob being this bit of red, anomalously warm water that essentially parked itself in the Northeast Pacific throughout 2014, 15, and into early 2016 as well. So that brought some really hot water to our uh, off our coasts. That suppressed upwelling, and that really limited the amount of bottom up processes that are going. So that limited the amount of food in the ecosystem and had really major and disastrous consequences for a lot of predators throughout the North Pacific. You may have seen photos like this. The photo on the right, especially being dramatic. I believe that's from the Alaska coast near Homer, but of huge, huge numbers of dead seabirds, especially common murres, washing up on the coasts all throughout the Northeast Pacific. And pretty much all of those that were examined, it was determined they had starved to death. It wasn't a harmful algal bloom, it wasn't an oil spill, just enormous numbers of murres starving to death from Alaska down to California. And they were not at all the only species. We saw huge die-offs of casts and sauklets during this time. And a little bit later in a subsequent marine heat wave, we saw huge numbers of tufted puffins up in the Bering Sea as well. Um, so the increase of marine heat waves, certainly a big bottom-up driving effect that's influencing our seabird populations pretty dramatically. But this is leading us to come to some sort of conclusion that there's heightened sensitivity to predator disturbance during low prey availability. So in other words, you can think that we have an established pattern of response of how murres respond to a predator when they're doing relatively well, but that they're even more sensitive to these predators when they are hungry, when they're already stressed. So, if you already are having a hard time feeding yourself, feeding your chick, you're underweight, and then a predator starts coming in increasingly often, you're going to be more likely to abandon your chick, just give up on breeding, than you would be if you were actually in healthy, good body condition and finding lots of food. But to actually assess if this is possible, we need to actually study those bottom-up processes. Um, and this is really hard to do. These data don't really exist in the wider world, partly because there's really not much of a commercial value for forage fish. So the things murres are eating, things like smelt, sand lance, herring, there are small local commercial fisheries for sure for some of these species, but they are much harder to sample than, say, salmon or tuna farther offshore. And so we have much less data available on these little tiny forage fish that live out in open ocean that are really just a couple of species driving all these upper trophic levels. But one of the great ways we can study those populations indirectly is by seeing what murres and other seabirds are eating. And we do this at Yaquina Head with this kind of funny setup where we're able to use a connector to attach a DSLR camera to a spotting scope. And in this way, get some, not beautiful, but usable images of murres coming in with fish to feed their chicks. Murres and most of the alcids, so like puffins and guillemots, are really great because they carry fish externally, whereas cormorants and gulls will swallow food and then regurgitate for their chicks. So that makes it much harder for us to study, but murres are really convenient in this sense that they'll bring these fish in a way that we can photograph and then use that to ID the fish, tell what kind of species it is. And we can also make a rough estimation of how large the fish is relative to the length of the murre's bill, which is fairly consistent between individuals. And in this way, using these same methods over many years, we can start to put together these time series of murre diets. So in these kind of plots, you'll see that each column represents a distinct year. The numbers on the bottom is the year. The number on top is the number of samples that we had for that year. And each color represents a different kind of prey. So you see that the colors vary a lot year to year, indicating that different prey species were important to murres in different years. So some years with a lot of green, we saw that murres were mostly feeding on herring. Years with a lot of purple, we saw that sand lance was really important. And years here with a lot of orange, smelt really dominated murre diets. And we had a master student in our lab, I guess maybe 10 years ago at this point, Amanda Gladix, who used these data from Yaquina Head murres to see that a lot of factors way out in the ocean, so things like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, El Nino cycles, so some of these really large scale things, as well as some really local factors like the amount of upwelling in an area, all drove what kinds of fish were available for Murres to feed on. Um, and this had impacts on the Murres. So, what kind of fish these Murres were feeding on had a direct impact on Murre reproductive success. So, in years with more and better prey available, Murres raised their chicks more successfully, or a larger number of Murres successfully produced chicks. And so that's great to know that there is a real distinct connection between these, sort of far off and hard to, mentally grasp uh, oceanographic processes that are having real direct effects here on the Murres right at Yaquina Head. And we also learned that seabird bill load photography can be really effective. There are a couple really great advantages of this technique. So data collection requires little knowledge of fish ID. The photos that we get can be really hard to identify. I took classes in undergrad and graduate school on how to ID some of these fish species. Um, Many of them require having, an individual in the hand and counting the number of specific uh, little bones, the number of rays on a fin. And we often can't do that with the photos, but can get to family level. But that still can be really challenging and hard to teach. Whereas it's really easy to teach an intern how to use this setup and get a lot of these photos. And then some of us who have had a lot more training can do the prey ID. So that's a huge advantage. I don't have to be in the field all the time taking these photos. You can also get many observations per day. Um, for instance, some ways of assessing diet, we get things like cormorant pellets. They'll regurgitate pellets, much like an owl might, and you can pick apart and look for the little bones inside to see, oh, this is a herring, this is a smelt. Um, but that's really time intensive, and you also get one sample per day. There are many fish represented, but it's hard to get many observations especially without causing a huge amount of disturbance to the colony. So there are huge advantages to seabird bill load photography, and really figuring out how we could do that effectively was one of the major takeaways from this project, and really made us wonder if we could apply these same methods to other species and other places. Um, Probably the most obvious place for us to apply these techniques was for tufted puffins, which have been declining dramatically in the lower 48, as well as in parts of BC and Southeast Alaska over the recent decades. In Oregon specifically, we've seen a decline of 90% in 40 years, from about 6,500 puffins to about 500. They're very, very difficult as burrow nesters to census. So all of these numbers, we don't even have great faith in how many precisely there are left, which is unfortunate. Um, but there have been really, really dramatic declines. And unfortunately, we also don't really understand why. And as I mentioned earlier, puffins in, I believe it's 2020, were denied Endangered Species Act protections by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Um, they they didn't, you know, disagree with the fact that there were these really dramatic declines in Washington, Oregon, and California. Um, there was essentially only debate and dispute over how well these populations were connected between the lower 48 and some of the populations in Alaska that are really large and are still doing pretty well. Um, so because some of those populations way off and the Aleutians are doing really well, they didn't think it warranted listing here. And was a little frustrating. But whatever you think about that decision, the review that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did was quite thorough and identified a lot of real key research limitations. For instance, we didn't know how important ocean conditions were in influencing the prey resources for puffins. We know this was important in influencing common Murre breeding success, so it's probably important for puffins, but we really have no idea how or in what direction. Um, and so this report that really, brought to light some of these huge research limitations emphasize how little we know about tufted puffins, despite them being such a charismatic and, for towns like Cannon Beach, Oregon, really emblematic species of the Northwest coast. Um, so at the very least, this report did motivate increased research activity, and a number of researchers now throughout the Northwest, i- including, some really guiding force from the National Audubon Society. We've begun to work more closely together and have tried to develop some recovery plans and um, are really sharing and collaborating on a lot more research projects so we can hopefully figure out what's driving this decline and what, if anything, we can do about it. And so the way our lab has tried to put our skills to use is now we have an intern go out to Cannon Beach on the north coast of Oregon. This huge island offshore is Haystack Rock, one of several with that name in Oregon, but this is the most famous one. One of the very few places in the world you can be walking on the beach, steps from your beach house and see breeding puffins coming in to breed at the very top of the rock. Um, and this really unrivaled accessibility has made it a great place for us to sponsor an intern with photography experience and a big camera that we provide to spend basically the whole later part of the summer photographing puffins coming in with fish. So you'd often see this is our intern Jaden from last summer on the beach, generally first thing in the morning, taking photos of puffins coming in with fish to feed their chicks. Um, and in the summer since 2022, we photographed 700 unique bill loads and have identified almost 3,000 unique prey items in those bill loads, um, which is pretty impressive considering that before that there were only maybe 2 dozen bill load samples from tufted puffins within the whole state of Oregon, and those were from the early 1980s. It's just kind of mind blowing how little we knew about such a charismatic species. So the advent of digital photography like this and these kind of techniques has just been really, really beneficial for studying some of these species that nest in, you know, accessible as in you're close to it, but there's really no way to safe to humans or the birds, access these nest sites to use traditional methods. So photography has been extremely helpful here. And a little sneak peek into some of the things we've learned. We're learning that tufted puffin diet at Haystack Rock is really diverse and varies a lot between years. So this is the same kind of plot that you saw before, with each column being a year and each color representing a portion of the tufted puffin's diet during that year. So if you pick any color and go across in just the 4 years that we have so far, you can see that there's really dramatic variation between years. And we've seen that puffin diet is quite diverse and variable. We've had over 10 different families of prey, um, probably more. We actually just can't identify all that closely with some of these photos. But we've learned that things like herring, smelt, rockfish, these are really important, as well as small larval fish, which we unfortunately can't identify further, just look like little pink spaghetti noodles at this point. Um, but we know that the amount of these different prey items varies year to year. 2025, for instance, we think was a not so good year. They ate a lot of kind of unusual prey. Saw lots of gattids, so things like tomcod, as well as squid and other things with really low energy values, really low caloric content being delivered, and a much lower provisioning rate. So a lot fewer feeds coming in per hour than in previous years. And that's all helping us learn about at least what years are good, what conditions are good for puffins, and what years are not. We've also had a couple of interesting sightings. For instance, lamprey um, have occurred in small numbers, but in each year of our study of tufted puffins, um, they are a really nutritious, high in fat, high in calorie species, which is great for growing puffin chicks. Um, they're also a state listed sensitive species in Oregon. So it's great to at least have this indirect metric of their abundance. And salmonids, of course, we know are really commercially valuable and that many stocks are threatened. Um, so it's really interesting to have this this really direct view of how a number of different species that are of conservation concern are all interacting and to an extent are all dependent on each other. The puffins need these fish for food, and it's also good to think about that some of the restoration projects and dollars that go to protecting salmon, that go to protecting lamprey, can also indirectly help tufted puffins as well. Um, so this is just a great illustration of how connected all of our marine ecosystems are. We've also learned yet just how much we don't know about even our most charismatic species. Um, as I mentioned, the only previous data was from about 40 years ago, and also just that one of the greatest hindrances to effective conservation is a lack of knowledge. We can't protect what we don't understand. We're at least now starting to get a better idea of some of the threats that puffins are facing, um, such as some years they don't have enough food to eat. And we're starting, as we collect more and more data, to understand the kind of conditions those are associated with. We've also learned that photography can be a really, really incredible tool. And we'd love to apply that more throughout our coastline. There's so much coast in Oregon, basically a mile for every day of the year. We've only been able to study, say, tufted puffins at one site and common murres at two. Um, and of course, if you're paying attention in the US, unfortunately, resources for traditional scientific research were always scarce and are nearly non-existent at this point. So we're trying to get a little creative on how we can effectively um, collect data in a more cost-efficient way, essentially. Um, and in that sense, we're trying to take advantage of the fact that Oregon and throughout the Northwest generally has many, many skilled birders and amateur nature photographers. And that's really the inspiration behind the Birds with Fish community science program, in which we're trying to collect photos from birders, nature photographers, um, anyone with a camera who happens to find themselves outside. If they see birds bringing back fish to their chicks, if they see birds feeding, and they can identify the prey in those photos, we can hopefully essentially crowdsource this information and have people turn their photos into actual scientific data. We've gotten a great number of submissions so far, some of them from really, really skilled photographers that um, are just beautiful to look at. Uh, Also incredibly diverse, really highlighting just, yeah, the incredible diversity of species in our Northwest coastal ecosystems. So far we've had 33 different kinds of prey identifiable, as well as 37 species of seabird or estuarine bird. The most commonly submitted being pigeon guillemots, tufted puffins, common murres. Um, so all, undoubtedly seabirds, but also plenty of things like great blue herons, common loons, pelagic cormorants, things that are often found in more nearshore estuarine waters, that often are easier for people without these crazy long cameras, which includes myself, to get closer to. So the great thing about this project is anybody can help. It's always distressing when people say, what can I do to help these species? And, unless you're directly the one controlling climate change, it's hard to give people a satisfying answer sometimes. Um, but this is a great way that we can have people contribute to science, help us learn more, just while they're out enjoying the coast or the beach. So just by sending us any photos from throughout the Oregon coast so far, we're hoping to expand some to the outer Oregon, the outer Washington and Northern California coast as well. But any photos of birds feeding can help us learn more about how we can protect these species. And as I mentioned, I don't have a big fancy camera. I am not a professional photographer. So it does not matter if you're a professional at all. Just using your phone up to binoculars or a spotting scope can often get pretty decent results. This photo of a murre I took, it's just my phone up to my binoculars. It is not pretty. It is not going to win any awards or get hung up on any walls, but it works. I can see that it's a common murre. I can see that it's eating a smelt. And most importantly, I also have the date it was taken, and the location. And it's really just having those little bits of information can help actually turn this from a photo into data. And so to take a step back and to think about how, these ecosystems function, how we started this talk today, whether it's the top-down or bottom-up factors that are really driving seabird populations on our coasts. We can change out those impala for some common murres and see that eagles are definitely having strong impact on common murre populations as the number of eagles increases as they recover. But we also see that the amount of prey, the amount of prey has direct impacts on murre reproduction in years when there aren't many prey, such as during marine heat waves, can have really disastrous impacts on um, both adult survival and the number of chicks produced. But of course, these things aren't existing in isolation. We see that the number of predators and the force of predation is impacted by things like pesticides, um, bringing populations down, or illegal protections helping to recover populations. See that these big marine heat waves have direct impacts on the amount of prey, as well as things like dams that impact numbers of salmonids or lamprey. Those are also probably having an indirect effect on our seabirds. And we've also found increasing evidence that there's these crazy interacting effects so that birds are more sensitive to eagles when they're not doing well and more resilient when they are finding enough food to eat. So it's not necessarily top down or bottom up. It's probably top down, bottom up, and the two together are having really drastic impacts on our seabird populations here in the Northwest. So what does this all mean for our birds? Essentially, the main takeaway is the more we learn, the more we can do. We can hopefully make better informed conservation and management decisions. As I said, being on the science side of thing and not the management, we can hopefully provide more data to management agencies like, say, Oregon Fish and Wildlife, Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, help them make more informed decisions um, that include both human needs, which they can take into account, as well as the needs of the species that they're there to protect. They can hopefully do that better and address potential human seabird conflict, say over salmonids, over Endangered Species Act protections. They can hopefully do that better with more data. And likewise, we can hopefully better anticipate potential new threats to Oregon seabirds. We already have a better baseline understanding of how these populations function, um, and say identifying there are always new fisheries opening up, closing down. We have better understanding of how important certain fish species are to birds. We can hopefully be proactive in gaining protection for certain species that are really important for birds, and all these sorts of upper trophic level predators that the public loves. Um, with that, I just want to acknowledge all the other work of all the other members in our lab, the graduate students, the research assistants, and Dr. Orban, and all of our funders, some of whom are on the left here, that have made all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening, and if there's any time, I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
We have a question in the chat. Well, Fawn was
Great.
asking, are your interns college students or can they be high schoolers?
Yeah, that's a great question. To some extent, it depends on how our funding is obtained. So for many years, we've had um, great relationship with National Science Foundation's Research Experience for Undergraduates program, the REU program, which has occurred at the Hatfield Marine Science Center, as well as a number of other universities each year. For things like that, it has to be an undergrad, a continuing undergrad. Um, we have not yet expanded to high school students, but I have to admit the fate of the REU program is a little uncertain. We're not sure if that's going to happen this year. Even though it's supposed to start in about a month and a half, still don't have any money for that. So, um, we might have to reach out even more broadly for interns. So yeah, it unfortunately depends, but we'd love to have people in paid positions if at all possible. So
Thank you. I had a question. I'm
Sure.
curious about the fish ID from the photographs. I mean, great to be including that, and it's certainly building your database. It must be really time consuming for the higher level researchers who have the capabilities. So I'm just wondering if there's any opportunity for AI. I'm thinking of some of the Ocean Networks Canada work that they've been doing with citizen science and machine learning to develop an
Hmm.
AI database of fish species.
That is a really great point, and definitely something that we have tried to look at a little bit. Um, we did write a grant that was not funded, but to try to do that more successfully, working with some of the fishery science professors here at OSU. Um, Anecdotally, while doing most of those pre-ID manually myself, have tried using platforms like iNaturalist, which has a great um, prey, at least a recommendation, a suggested ID. Um, and depending on the photo, it can be quite good. So I think there is definitely a really high potential of actually using AI to help streamline that process, um, which would be great, and hopefully just let us even process more data, which hopefully we'll get with programs like Birds with Fish.
Mhm. Thank you. We'll open the floor to any other questions from folks who have joined us today.
Kathy has a question, or maybe it's Yogi that has the question. So, off of Victoria here, we're interested in herring dynamics, and for example, whether they're adult herring that hang around here all year round, or if it's larval herring, or how that changes over the years. So, what we've done is we're partnered with whale watching boats. And on their tours, they do the regular sort of areas that they work in, and they've been documenting bait balls for us.
Hmm.
So the question, of course, with bait balls is, what species it is. And so our approach was to get scale samples, from the water after after the fish have been kind of messed about with whatever is chasing them. That has not been particularly successful,
Hmm.
but it's been, I mean, all the scales we found were from juvenile herring. And there's other evidence suggests that at least now, all the herring schools here are juvenile herring, adult herring only in this spawning season. And,
Hmm.
but, um, the bait balls have a certain types of birds that hang out with them. So I was thinking, well, we could get a good guess as to what's there based on what kind of birds there are. But your data suggests that the birds themselves are hitting quite a diversity of fish. Um, so I was wondering. I mean, the other day we saw a bait ball, and it had lots of glaucous gulls, diving into the water, and it acted pretty much like an adult herring kind of situation. Well, no, when we get with cormorants there as well. And then on the smaller fish, you see more of the smaller diving birds that are there. I don't know if your database has anything that would inform this, or if somehow your bird pictures, that could be also serve to do this. I mean, the whale watching boats, of course, they're full of people with big lenses.
Yeah, and we certainly have some whale watching operations in our local area that operate all throughout the summer, and we've reached out to them a little bit. But I mean, that's great to know that you all have had some success with that. Um, we'll have to reach out to them some more. I mean, that's a great thing that we could hopefully expand our efforts and focus on. Um, we think to some extent it probably depends on the bird species about how much the presence of a certain bird could indicate what prey it is. think that a lot of things like Murres and puffins are really opportunistic. So their diet, we think, is changing year to year just because the essentially the ratio, the abundance of different species changes each year, and they're just feeding more or less randomly in a representative means of what's available. Um, so we can hopefully use those data to to see that, say, smelts probably are increasing off the Central Oregon coast, at least relative to other species, because they're occurring more and more often in Murre diets now. The size issue of adult versus small herring is difficult. A Murre just couldn't swallow a full foot-long adult herring. Um,
Mhm.
but certainly with some species, I bet we could. Some of the cormorants or some things that are able to feed on larger individuals. Uh,
Mhm.
if we could find an efficient way of if monitoring their diets throughout the year, I think that could be helpful in learning more about more than just a juvenile fish. So
The- can I ask another question?
please.
Um, so, no, there's different nutritional values, say, between a herring and a smelt, and I think that's what that master's thesis was maybe looking at was, what the reproductive success is associated with, a high smelt diet versus a high herring diet or something like that.
Mhm.
What was the conclusion? Did it really show, say, better nutritional value from any of this species? Or, I mean, you mentioned lamprey, but there's probably not that many lamprey, but.
No, yeah, lamprey have always been a pretty um, small part of the diets. Yeah, so the graduate student I mentioned was essentially looking at that in an indirect manner. Um, and actually found that the Murres here tended to do quite well with smelts.
Mhm.
There's unfortunately this, which don't necessarily have the highest, say, fat content or energy content compared to others. Things like adult sand lance or
Mhm.
adult herring have a much higher, say, number of lipids per gram than some other species. We think if they're eating things like salmon or, you know, well, yeah, salmon, gadids, or some of the bottom fishes, that's a good indication that conditions are bad, that they're expanding to those less common prey resources because there's not more of their preferred prey. Um, but there's a whole quality versus quantity issue um, we think might be interfering a little bit, whereas the smelts maybe are closer to shore or more accessible in some way,
Mhm.
so that even though they don't have the highest nutrition content, when there are
Mhm.
lots of smelts, the Murres can do well, maybe by feeding on a larger number of a less nutritious thing than a few of a more nutritious thing. But that's all been pretty indirect, the way that we've come at that so far. And the actual quality of a herring, the amount of fat can vary year to year as well. And so we actually are working with a master's student at the University of California, Santa Cruz right now, Jaden, who was actually our tufted puffin photographer the last summer, is working at looking about what kinds of species and bill load compositions actually bring the most energy to puffins. And we're hopefully collecting some fish from fishery surveys. So some small rockfish, some small smelts, and using bomb calorimetry to actually figure out how many, say, calories or how many fats are actually in all these fish. So we're hopefully directing our research to a more direct um, look at least energy content. Still a little bit difficult to tell exactly how many smelts and where they are, how closely, densely aggregated they are. Um, but we're hoping to get more direct looks at all of the factors that influence that.
There's a group doing the work with respect to food for the Chinook salmon. So they're
Mhm.
looking at the energy content of similar prey as your birds are eating, with respect to the health of the Chinook. So, I mean, there might be some crossover there in terms of the information. So, for example, they are finding that late spawning herring are, of higher value, and I mean it correlates better with the size of the smolts coming out. So there's both a timing and an energy component to that. But the late spawning herring seem to be more valuable to the Chinook than the early
Hmm.
spawning ones.
I hadn't heard that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's published yet, but it could connect you with the guy. And, there might be some um, crossover, with the birds.
Yeah. Yeah, we certainly work with some salmon biologists in the States, at least, working for NOAA. They've, to some extent, NOAA's funded some of this diet research, probably because of the implications for salmon. Um, but this is all a great reminder of, how we're all trying to get at similar problems from different angles, and should keep trying to collaborate and work more closely.
Yes.
Gloria, I see you unmuted. Did
Oh,
you have a question?
comment and a question. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that was a really interesting presentation, and you guys are doing some very innovative research, so good on you. My question is a little bit strange because I'm just kind of interested in brown pelicans. I know that they have not been a focus of your research, but I know a number of years ago they were really having a lot of trouble in California. And as I understand it, their numbers have increased somewhat, uh, but they are in Oregon and southern BC. So I'm just wondering, do you have any data, especially recent information about brown pelicans?
We have not collected a whole lot directly on brown pelicans, at least on these research projects. We do work with some folks within Oregon, including the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who do collect more data on that. Um, uh, our lab also surveys for marbled murrelets in the near shore, so doing small boat work up and down the coast from, well, every 2 years we cover between Cape Mendocino and the Columbia River. Um, and we collect data on brown pelicans, all the brown pelicans we see during that time as well. So I don't personally have any great analyses on those data or insight. We collect those data and pass them off to other folks who are more focused, but their
Mm,
numbers certainly have increased in
yeah.
recent decades in Oregon. Um, and interestingly, I think they are also having a hard time this year. Um, some of their breeding season this last winter and early spring was not so successful. There are a lot of birds suffering in Southern California because of the marine heat wave. Um, and at least here on the central Oregon coast, we started to see brown pelicans, a couple weeks earlier than usual, um, and in larger numbers already than we're used to for this time of year. So it's interesting to think about them as also potential indicators of ocean conditions, at least for 1,000 miles south of here. So
Mhm.
interestingly, we also in one year, especially when they were suffering, we saw an increase in brown pelican disturbance at the common murre colony as well. Um, Periodically, just pelicans coming in as huge, kind of clumsy uh, landing birds, at least,
Mhm.
cause murres to scatter a little bit, and that happens every year to some extent. But they were trying to eat the murre chicks, and actually ate a number of them. Um, and ended up chasing a large number of murre chicks that were too young to fledge off the cliffs, um, and caused a huge amount of disturbance, and really impacted breeding success. And that happened in 2012, and that was the only year we've really seen it to that scale. Um, but it's also interesting to think about, maybe like bald eagles, they're really not doing well, or some of their other food sources aren't available. They might expand and try to take advantage of an abundant and highly concentrated amount of murre chicks. But
Mhm.
yeah, a little morbid, but interesting.
Yeah.
So
You'll have to change your view on pelicans, Gloria.
I know.
Uh,
Still cute. I don't know.
oh, great. Yeah, always excited to see them. So,
Yeah, I just saw a flock of pelicans last week heading north, right off Seal Rock here, which was like, whoa, you know, didn't expect
pretty,
that.
yeah, pretty exceptionally early. And for a lot of adults, and yeah, all very strange. I guess we'll see more about what this coming summer brings.
Mhm.
So,
Hmm. Excellent. Okay. Well, Garcia, I think if there is no more questions, we can thank you, Will, for your patience as we got you all logged in here. Appreciated your talk because it's amazing. I always think I know a lot about our birds here, but I'm always learning so much more. And it's pretty impressive. So thank you again for this information. I think this is great. The reason I had asked about the high school intern, because I had a high schooler that sent me some photographs saying, "Are you interested in a photographer?" And so, as a tide pool ambassador, we can chat later if you'd like, because I know that through Oregon Coast STEM Hub, I get funding to pay high schoolers to be tide pool ambassadors. So we might talk to Dr. Almasi about an internship for you for a
oh,
high schooler. Okay.
that could be great. Yeah, thank you so much.
The
All
world
right.
is a big tide pool.
Yeah, it is. All right. So thank you again. We really appreciate your time and information. And if that's it, Garcia, do I need to do anything else?
Thanks,
No.
I think
thanks
that's
everyone
wonderful.
for joining us.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.